I felt it in my stomach the moment she walked past me in the kitchen, ignoring the coffee cup I'd set out for her. That specific, visceral twist. Disgust, but not at her alone. At us. At the hollowness where there should have been warmth. The sensation shot through me, turning my own home into an alien space, like I'd been dropped onto a stage in the middle of a production I no longer recognized. The morning light slanted through the window, hitting the counter right where I stood, and I remember thinking how I should feel comforted by that gentle glow. Instead, I just felt superfluous. I stood there, forcing a swallow of lukewarm coffee, watching the back of her figure, Julia, my wife of nearly 2 decades, moving toward the sink with a stiffness that screamed she didn't want me near her. As she rinsed a glass, I tried to recall when I last saw her smile at me for no reason. My memory gave me nothing but static. She turned, offered me the faintest hint of eye contact, then stared pointedly at the clock and said, "I'm running late." Then she left without a goodbye kiss, not even a gentle brush of her hand on my shoulder. That was when I knew something had curdled between us, and it nauseated me more than I expected. She worked at a local historical society, archiving old documents in a sterile building that smelled of musty paper and rarely got direct sunlight. Ordinarily, I'd drive her there if my schedule allowed, but she had insisted on taking her own car for months now. The small, seemingly innocent changes had piled up. Car rides, lunches, phone calls, text messages that ended abruptly when I walked in. At first, I chalked it up to a midlife shift, stress at work, or maybe just the natural ebb and flow of marriage. But that morning, as I stood there with the stinging bitterness in my gut, I realized it went deeper than that. I told myself to calm down, to finish my coffee and head to my job downtown. 48 is too old for drama, I thought. I'm too stable, too practical for that. Yet a part of me, a primal, half-buried part, snarled with suspicion. That sense of being unwelcome in my own domain wouldn't leave my chest. By the time I got to work, I felt like my own tie was a noose around my neck. The office seemed stifling, too bright in spots, too dark in others. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen with unblinking eyes. Files, emails, spreadsheets. None of them held meaning in that moment. My mind was consumed by a single question. What the hell happened to us? I didn't get an answer that day or the next, but the feeling of displacement, of being cast aside, thickened each time Julia looked at me without warmth. Days turned into a tense routine. We'd speak about necessary things, mostly regarding our 16-year-old son, Jake. Logistics, groceries, bills, schedules. She was cordial, so perfectly polite that it cut deeper than if she just shouted or stormed. It was as though our marriage had sunk below the surface, drifting quietly into an ocean trench where no light could penetrate. I first encountered Adrian Parker in the most innocuous way. A friendly wave in front of our house on a weekend morning, him standing by his Jeep parked at the curb, wearing jeans and a vintage t-shirt. Julia introduced him as Adrian, a freelance photographer working on an archive project. Her voice sounded a little too bright, the kind of forced cheer that sets off alarms in anyone paying attention. But I forced a casual nod, focusing on the camera slung around his shoulder. "Martin," I said, extending my hand. Adrian's handshake was firm enough, but I felt something, perhaps my own insecurities, skitter down my spine. He smiled, broad and open, meeting my gaze with an enthusiasm that felt practiced. "You have a beautiful home, Mr. Cole," he said in that easy, laid-back West Coast tone. I was just telling Julia how the morning light here is incredible, perfect for some portrait shots. Julia's cheeks flushed for a moment, and she turned away to fuss with a pile of mail on the console table in our hallway. I shrugged. "Well, Seattle's got a knack for dramatic lighting. I guess we're used to it by now." Adrian nodded, and let his eyes wander around the living room with an appreciative spark. For the next few minutes, he and Julia discussed some old documents she'd been scanning and how Adrian might photograph them with natural light to capture the textures. I stood off to the side, listening. Something about the way she spoke to him, soft, but not in the warm, affectionate manner she used to reserve for me, triggered a warning in my gut. But I had no evidence, just a nebulous sense that I was the third wheel in my own marriage. In the weeks that followed, he popped up more frequently. Julia claimed they had expanded the project and needed more time to catalog historical photographs for the Society's archives. She sounded so matter-of-fact, as if there was nothing unusual about a family friend spending hours in our house, kneeling on our living room floor with prints spread all around. Adrian would nod politely at me when I passed by, always cheerful, always respectful. Yet there was a tension in the air that felt almost alive. One Sunday, they sat at the dining table, heads bent together over an old ledger. Julia's hair brushed his shoulder. I lingered in the kitchen, out of their line of sight, clenching and unclenching my fists, as I fought the sense that I was intruding on them. Eventually, I cleared my throat loudly as I walked in. They both jumped, as if shocked out of some private sphere. Julia flashed me a brief, polite smile. Adrian slid the ledger aside, glancing at me with a mixture of curiosity and apology. "Everything okay, Martin?" Julia asked. She used that calm, neutral tone that put me on edge. "Just getting some water," I answered, ignoring the dryness in my throat that felt anything but natural. I had no reason to doubt her words at that point, no tangible proof. But the suspicion warmed deeper into me. Then came the day I first saw something that shredded my illusions. I had left work early, citing a headache, so I could come home, and if I'm being honest, spy a bit. Julia usually wrapped up her shift at the archives around 4. I pulled into the driveway shortly before 2, turned off the car engine, and sat there, listening to my own heartbeat. I felt like some detective in a noir film, waiting for the suspect to slip up. The house was quiet when I entered. Our dog, a scruffy terrier mix Jake had adopted, came trotting over, tail wagging. I patted his head absent-mindedly. Julia's car wasn't in the driveway, so I started to think maybe I was just letting paranoia get the best of me. But as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I heard a muffled sound, a rustling, a breath. I paused, my heart thumping in my ears. Another sound, soft but unmistakable, came from behind the door at the end of the hallway. Jake's old playroom, now mostly used for storage. I took a slow step forward, feeling like the ground might give way beneath me. The door was ajar. Inside, I glimpsed shapes shifting in the dim light, slender afternoon sun slicing through the blinds. The first thing I registered was Julia's blouse undone at the top. Then I saw Adrian's hand moving along her waist, pulling her closer. He leaned in, and she tilted her head back, eyes closed, lips parted in a silent moan. The hush made it worse somehow, like they were afraid to break the tension they'd built with their bodies. I think I froze for 3 full seconds, trying to process that the woman in another man's arms was my wife of 19 years. My stomach hollowed out, as if some cosmic punch had landed, knocking the air out of me. A wave of something, anger, shame, revulsion, washed over me, so powerful I swayed. Suddenly, everything I knew about my life was unraveling in front of me. The sense of disgust flared up again, but it was even more potent than before. Disgust at the sight, at them, at the deception, at me for standing there in silent shock. Finally, I made a sharp, involuntary sound in my throat. It snapped them apart. Julia gasped, eyes wide, hand flying to cover her chest. Adrian turned swiftly, his face pale. For one searing moment, we locked eyes. There was no apology there, only a flicker of panic. And then I turned and walked out. I'm not even sure my footsteps made a sound. My mind roared with static. Down the stairs I went, half blind with rage, shoving my arms into my coat sleeves, though I didn't recall picking the coat up. As I lunged for the door, I heard Julia calling my name. "Martin, wait!" The urge to tear the door off its hinges gripped me, but I wrenched it open calmly, stepping outside into the crisp Seattle air. My breath came in ragged pulls as I made it to my car. My hand shook so violently that it took 2 attempts to jam the key into the ignition. Behind me, I heard the door open, heard Julia's voice again, but I refused to look. I started the car and pulled out, nearly clipping the hedge in the process. I drove for what felt like hours without any sense of direction. The city blurred around me, a backdrop to the fierce storm in my mind. The initial shock gave way to a throbbing rage that built each time I blinked and recalled the image of her arching toward him. I felt a raw, howling sense of betrayal, shot through with a shame I couldn't articulate. I was humiliated. At 48 years old, having provided a stable life, a stable home, I discovered I wasn't enough. I ended up in an old diner near the waterfront, the kind that served greasy food and bottomless coffee. I slid into a booth, feeling the cheap vinyl stick to my jacket. The waitress poured coffee, asked if I wanted anything else. I shook my head numbly. Then I sat there, staring at the swirling steam. Memories battered me, unstoppable. The day Julia and I first met at a campus fundraiser. Our wedding, the joy of seeing Jake being born, the small rituals we built over nearly 2 decades. And now, the real-time flash of her in the arms of another man. I tried to imagine going back, confronting them, demanding an explanation. But I was too raw for that. Instead, I sipped scalding coffee, tasting bitterness that matched my mood. Hours slipped by. Eventually, I checked my phone. No missed calls from Julia, which stung more than it should. She had tried to call out to me, but now, nothing. I returned home late. The living room was empty, lights dimmed. I climbed the stairs, half dreading what I'd find. The door to our bedroom was shut. I hovered outside it, listening. No voices, no movement. Slowly, I cracked it open. Julia was alone, sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing an old t-shirt of mine. She looked up the moment I stepped in, her eyes rimmed with red. I braced myself for her to speak, but she said nothing. We just stared at each other, an endless quiet passing between us, thick with accusations and unspoken guilt. After a while, she whispered, "I'm sorry," so softly I barely heard it. I didn't respond. My anger felt too large, too jagged, like it could cut me from the inside out if I tried to talk. Instead, I turned and left the room, heading for the guest bedroom. That was the first night in nearly 20 years I slept in a separate bed. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, my thoughts veering from cold fury to profound sadness to a twisted numbness that felt worse than either. The next day, I stumbled through work in a daze. No one commented, though I suspect my coworkers saw how haggard I looked. My boss, noticing my distraction, pulled me aside to ask if everything was all right. I lied, saying I just had a family emergency. Then I buried myself in spreadsheets and deadlines, trying to shut out the replay of that scene. Her blouse undone, Adrian's hand on her waist. When I got home, I found Julia in the kitchen. She wore an expression of uncertainty, as though unsure how I'd greet her. Again, she tried to apologize. This time, I cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't," I muttered. The word came out clipped. I felt an avalanche of anger pressing against my chest, ready to roar out. But I clamped down on it. Instead, I turned away and walked to the bedroom. I didn't have the strength yet to handle a confrontation. My emotions ricocheted between fury and heartbreak so violently that if I tried to speak, I might just lose control. For several days, we avoided each other under the same roof. She spent hours at work or at the Historical Society. I came home late. Jake sensed something was off, but neither of us explained. Julia and I existed in this bizarre, wordless stalemate, like two strangers forced to share a small lifeboat, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Then a text message from Jake changed everything. My phone buzzed one evening after I left the office. Normally, Jake's texts were full of typical teenage humor, memes, quick questions about chores, or notifications that he was at a friend's house. But this message contained no words, just a photo. It was a shot of Julia and Adrian, arms around each other, faces close, looking like lovers on an intimate date. My breath stalled in my throat. The angle suggested it wasn't some official archival project shot. They looked too comfortable. The background a place I didn't recognize, maybe a new restaurant or some out-of-the-way spot. The image had a certain quality, like it had been forwarded, possibly from social media, possibly from Adrian's phone. I wasn't sure. Jake's silent act of sending me the photo told me volumes. He knew. He was letting me know that he knew. And that he wanted me to see this. Rage flared. Not the wild, raw shock I'd felt the day I caught them, but a more calculated anger. I understood now that her betrayal wasn't just a single moment of weakness. It was a pattern, a life she'd been living behind my back, and it had pulled Jake into a vortex of confusion and pain. That evening, Julia came home around 9. I stood in the living room, waiting. She entered, flicking on the light, her face drawn. Our eyes met. I held up my phone, the photograph visible on the screen. I didn't say a word. For a second, she looked like she might faint. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Finally, she whispered, "Martin, don't." I growled, cutting her off again. "Jake sent me this." Her lips quivered. "It's not what you think." The oldest cliché. She must have known how pathetic it sounded, but she said it anyway. My voice was low and menacing. "So you're just friends. That's why you're in his arms, looking like you can't wait to get him alone." She flinched. Then, in a burst of raw frustration, she barked. "We were having problems. We drifted. It just happened. But it doesn't mean I don't love you or that we aren't a family." I let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "Family," I repeated softly. "Right." Slowly, I powered off my phone, slid it into my pocket, and turned to head upstairs. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing my sleeve, but I pulled back. "Martin," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, we can talk about this." "I'm done talking," I said coldly. "I need space." I didn't even sleep in the guest bedroom that night. Instead, I wandered into the living room, unrolled an old sleeping bag, and lay on the couch. The entire night, I stared at the dark ceiling, feeling my life fracturing bit by bit. Anger clawed at my insides, but a deeper ache threatened to swallow me whole. By morning, something in me had changed, a kind of detachment. If conversation wouldn't solve this, I'd do something else. I'd secure my own future. I'd defend myself. Quietly, methodically, I started opening cabinets, pulling old folders, gathering every scrap of financial, legal, and personal documentation. I took leave from work under the pretense of a family crisis. I changed passwords on our joint accounts, restructured the administrative privileges, and canceled the power of attorney we'd once set up for each other. Little steps, each one fueling a sense of grim purpose. If she could slip away emotionally, I would ensure I wasn't left vulnerable in more ways than one. The next step was the safe deposit box. We had one at a local bank, used to store important papers, a few sentimental heirlooms, and the deed to the house. I visited it, rummaging through the contents, feeling a strange calm as I inventoried everything. There in that silent cubicle under fluorescent lights, I realized how mechanical I'd become. My emotional fireworks had subsided into an icy clarity. She had shattered something, and I was building a fortress of logic and paperwork to protect what was left. A few days later, I discovered that the digital archive Julia had worked on for 2 decades was wide open to certain vulnerabilities, something to do with user permissions and file-sharing protocols. She had always been protective of her work, but she never imagined I'd look into it. I'm not even sure why I did. Curiosity, vengeance, desperation. Maybe a mix of all three. Inside that archive, I found more than old newspapers and photographs. I found entire subfolders of personal correspondence between Julia and Adrian, along with scanned documents, emails with date stamps, and mentions of medical tests. My breath caught. Cross-referencing them, I realized they were about a paternity test. And not for Jake. Someone else's child. Another entire layer of betrayal. I didn't have every piece of the puzzle, but it was enough to see that she'd been intimately involved in secrets that had nothing to do with me. Shock hammered me anew. There were references to Adrian's boy, to an unclear father, and to DNA results. The writing was cryptic, but the subtext was enough to twist my stomach. Apparently, the child was not Adrian's, but there was some other father in the picture. I felt sick. Did Julia have an entire second life with him? Or was she just facilitating something for him? Then I stumbled on a final note. He thinks the child is his, advising we keep it quiet. My mind reeled. This was their world, hidden in the very archive she curated. A library of secrets, lying in the same place as old city records. God, it was humiliating. To realize she and Adrian had used her workplace as a safe haven for their twisted entanglements. At that point, I didn't want to see or speak to her, so I didn't. I spent the next few nights at a motel near the highway, a dingy place with a flickering neon sign, the rooms reeking of disinfectant and stale smoke. The staff barely glanced at me when I checked in. It was the perfect spot to hunker down and analyze my next steps. I used my laptop to dig deeper, cross-checking the archive data with bank statements, phone records. The more I found, the more enraged I became. But it was a cold kind of rage, fueling me to gather everything I might need for a legal blow, if it came to that. I returned home on a Friday, just after noon. Jake was at school. Julia was there, in the kitchen, surprise and relief mingling on her face. "Where have you been?" she asked, voice trembling. I shrugged off my coat. "I needed time," I said flatly. Then, without ceremony, I went upstairs, found an empty suitcase, and started gathering clothes. Socks, shirts, underwear. I spotted a marker on the nightstand, one I used to label my gym clothes. Some random memory spiked through me. I had once jokingly labeled my socks with the phrase, "Only my steps matter." A weird inside joke I told Julia after she mocked me for being too neat. She had laughed and called me childish, but in an affectionate way. Remembering that laughter felt like a knife to the gut. Julia hovered in the doorway. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice cracking. I folded a shirt methodically. "For a while, yeah. Maybe longer." My tone was calm, like I was stating a fact of life, not a seething heartbreak. She moved closer, tears welling in her eyes. "Martin, don't. Please." Her voice wavered, and I saw genuine fear in her expression. But I no longer felt pity. Something in me had dried up. "We're not good for each other," I said quietly. "At least not now." She stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. I could feel it trembling. "It's not what you think," she tried again, that same broken refrain. I was lost. We both were. Adrian was. He was just someone who made me feel alive. But I swear I don't want to lose our family. I swear. For a second, I almost let my anger rise, let the scathing words pour out about what I'd discovered, about the documents, the child, the fact that she had lied to me, involved me in her webs of secrecy. Instead, I gently removed her hand from my arm. "I'm going to gather my stuff," I said. "Then I'm out. I don't hate you, Julia. I just can't live like this." She started to sob, tears streaming down her cheeks. The sight of her pain twisted my heart, but I felt no desire to comfort her, only an icy acceptance that our marriage was over, or close enough. I zipped the suitcase. My wedding band glinted in the light, mocking me with its symbolism. For a second, I considered tearing it off, but something in me refused to let go of that last piece of dignity. Instead, I turned, lifted the suitcase, and brushed past her. Downstairs, I found Jake standing by the front door, eyes wide. I hadn't even heard him come in. He looked at the suitcase, then at me. "Dad, you're leaving?" he asked, voice cracking with the uncertainty of a teenager who still needed a father's reassurance. I felt a surge of guilt. Just for a while, bud, I said, setting the suitcase down. We can still see each other as much as you want. This has nothing to do with you. His eyes flicked upstairs, where Julia's muffled sobs were audible. I get it, he said quietly. I'm not a kid, Dad. Just don't vanish, okay? I pulled him into a hug, feeling the solidity of his shoulders. I won't, I promised. Then I stepped outside. It was a chilly day, gray clouds roiling overhead, the promise of Seattle drizzle in the air. I drove to the motel and tried to gather my thoughts. Over the next few days, an odd numbness set in. I spent my time finalizing the cancellation of shared services, transferring property where needed, moving funds into a separate account. Each mechanical step kept me from collapsing under the emotional weight. While there, I received an unexpected text from Jake again. Just a short message. I didn't delete that picture. I also have more. He didn't elaborate. But I sensed he was trying to show solidarity with me. I thought about how messed up this was for him. No kid should see their mother in such a compromised position. It hardened my resolve not to back down. In my darkest moments, I questioned if I was somehow to blame. Had I neglected Julia's emotional needs, made her feel unappreciated? But each time those thoughts arose, I recalled the hush in that room, the image of them entwined, and the quiet defiance in her eyes whenever she claimed it just happened. No, there was a line that she had crossed, an entire labyrinth of lies. My own mistakes didn't excuse that betrayal. A week later, Jake forwarded another photo. This time, it was a shot from some party, maybe a gathering to celebrate Adrian's latest photography exhibit. Julia was leaning into him, laughing, while his hand rested intimately on the small of her back. She looked carefree, radiant even. I stared at that image, feeling the nauseating swirl of sorrow and fury. If she was truly sorry, how did she so easily look that happy in his company? Soon after, I did something uncharacteristic of me. I confronted Adrian directly, or at least I tried to. I waited outside the Historical Society building, the one where Julia worked, half hoping he might appear. Sure enough, he came walking out around dusk, camera bag over his shoulder, face glowing with the flush of apparent success. I stepped into his path. The shock on his face when he recognized me was palpable. His hand twitched near his camera strap, like he was considering using it as a shield. We stood there, neither of us speaking for a tense moment. Then I said, "Adrian." He cleared his throat. "Martin, look, I raised a hand. "I just have one thing to say. Stay away from my family." My tone was dangerously calm. His eyes flicked with a mix of guilt and defiance. "I care about Julia," he began. "I never wanted." "You never wanted to what?" I snapped, the anger inside me finally surfacing. "Destroy a marriage. Drive a wedge between a mother and her son." He took a half step back, as though physically struck by my words. "I'm sorry," he said finally, voice trembling. "Things got out of hand." "Out of hand," I repeated quietly, tasting the words. "Do you realize the pain you've caused? The position you've put Jake in?" He swallowed, looking genuinely disturbed. "Julia, she said things were broken between you two." I thought. "Thought what?" "That it was fine to waltz in and take what you wanted. That my marriage was an empty husk, so why not?" My voice rose, cutting through the evening air. Adrian exhaled, shoulders slumping. "I never meant to hurt anyone." "Too late for that," I said. We stared at each other, the tension thick, until finally I turned away, refusing to let him see my eyes burn with anger any longer. I left him standing there, looking smaller than he had before. When I got back to the motel, I found a text from Julia. "We need to talk about Jake. He's not handling this well." A swell of guilt and responsibility hit me. She was right. Jake was caught in the crossfire of our imploding lives. I texted back a simple, Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the house, she agreed. The following morning, I walked into the familiar living room. Julia was there, hugging herself as though trying to hold the pieces of her life together. She looked exhausted, eyes puffy, posture slumped. For a moment, the sight almost stirred pity. Then I remembered how she had chosen this path. My pity drained away, replaced by a steely resolve. We talked about Jake, school, therapy, the possibility of him staying with me part-time. The conversation was stilted, painful, each word weighed down by all that remained unsaid. We avoided discussing Adrian or the affair directly. Until, near the end, she suddenly blurted out, "I'm ending it with him." I stared at her, uncertain if I even believed her. Is that supposed to fix things? After everything? She swallowed. "I don't know," she whispered, tears welling up again. "But he's not important, Martin. We are. I'm fighting for us." "Don't," I said, so softly she almost didn't hear. "It's too late to fight for us." The bitterness in my voice was undeniable. Her shoulders shook, and she sank onto the couch. "I never stopped loving you," she choked. "I was just empty. I thought something was missing, so I went looking for it. Adrian was. He was an escape." I felt a flash of anger twist my gut. An escape from what exactly? I asked. "From the life we built. From the vow you made in front of our families. From the father of your son." She crumpled, sobbing, unable to answer. I turned away, too drained to watch her tears. I recalled that line from somewhere. Sometimes, there's no going back after betrayal. I felt it in my bones now. We were too fractured, too worn down. I placed the house key on the coffee table in front of her and left, quietly closing the door behind me. What followed was a period of eerie calm. Weeks passed, and we interacted only for Jake's sake. I saw him more often, picking him up from school, taking him out for burgers or a movie. He tried to mask his hurt with teenage stoicism, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He'd text me sometimes late at night. "You okay, Dad?" I usually responded with some half-truth, telling him I was fine, that I'd figure it all out. I avoided seeing Julia, but I still felt her presence in my life, a dull ache that refused to go away. Sometimes I'd recall a random memory, a road trip to the Grand Canyon, a Christmas morning when we couldn't stop laughing, and it would slice through me. The bitterness that followed fueled my determination to move on, to finalize the severing of our shared life. The real blow came when she discovered how thoroughly I'd cut her out of my financial and legal affairs. She called me, voice ragged with anger. "You changed the passwords to everything," she accused, sounding betrayed. "Yes," I said simply. "I don't trust you anymore." She inhaled sharply, then tried to calm herself. We can't break every bond, Martin. We have a house, a child." "You have a house," I corrected. "I don't live there anymore. And Jake is old enough to decide where he wants to be." "You can't shut me out like this," she protested. "We were together for 19 years. That was before you decided to rewrite your vows with Adrian Parker." I shot back, my voice turning cold. "Now you get to deal with the consequences." She hung up, and I let the silence ring in my ears. I felt no remorse for protecting myself. If that made me cruel, so be it. A part of me still swirled with unresolved pain, but I buried it beneath a mountain of practicalities. Life dragged on, each day a test of my resilience. I worked, I paid my bills, I checked on Jake. The emotional storm never fully abated, but it receded enough that I could function without feeling like I was drowning. Over time, I realized something. I had survived the worst heartbreak of my life, and I was still standing. Eventually, Julia insisted we have one final conversation about the future, about divorce, finances, property. I agreed, half wondering if she'd try to salvage what was left. On the appointed day, I drove to the house, heart pounding with a strange blend of dread and anticipation. I found her in the living room, the furniture rearranged, the place looking different but still familiar enough to hurt. She offered me coffee. I shook my head. We sat down across from each other on the couch, an invisible chasm between us. She cleared her throat. "I want to make this right, Martin," she said. "Even if we can't fix our marriage, we can at least find a fair resolution." I nodded, appreciating the attempt at civility. "Fine." We spoke about who would handle the mortgage, how we'd split certain accounts, what we'd do about the property in Florida that my parents might pass on to me someday. The discussion was uncomfortably polite, like negotiating a business deal, rather than dismantling nearly 2 decades of life together. Throughout it all, I watched her expression shift from stoic determination to flashes of grief. But I no longer had the strength to console her. At one point, she tried to bring up Adrian, but I cut her off with a raised hand. "I don't want to know," I said. "It changes nothing." She nodded, swallowing hard. When we finished, I felt a sense of finality sink into my chest. 19 years, undone by months of lies, and a few pieces of signed paperwork. That's how it goes, I guess. I stood, stuffed the paperwork into my bag, and said, "Okay, I'll have my lawyer look this over." She blinked at me, tears shining. Then she did something I didn't expect. She grabbed my wrist, gently, and pressed a small piece of paper into my palm. A note, scrawled in her handwriting. I glanced at it, reading the words, "I'm sorry, Martin. Please forgive me someday." My throat tightened. I slipped the note into my jacket pocket without responding. Then I walked out to the front lawn. The air felt heavy with the threat of rain. Jake was at a friend's house, which was probably for the best. I needed to leave quietly, the way I had once before. Except this time, there was no coming back. Before getting into my car, I paused. My reflection stared back at me in the car window, older and more hollowed out than I remembered. But beneath that hollowness, I sensed a strange new resilience. All the agony, the betrayal, the humiliation, it hadn't killed me. It hadn't even broken me completely. Somehow, I was still here. Different, but alive. I drove to my motel, took a hot shower, and stared at the water running down the drain. The image of her with Adrian still haunted me. But instead of rousing fury, it now felt like an echo from a life I was shedding. I realized then that my revenge wasn't something dramatic or violent. My revenge was simply walking away, cutting her off, forcing her to face the reality of what she'd done without me there to cushion the consequences. In the weeks that followed, I packed up the last of my belongings, boxing up memories I couldn't bear to look at. I found little mementos, photographs from college, Jake's baby shoes, postcards from our early vacations. Each item stabbed at me, reminding me of how I once believed in the solidity of our relationship. Yet each item also reminded me that nothing, no betrayal, could take away the years I had lived. They were mine, for better or worse. Jake chose to stay with me in a small rental apartment near his school. He said he wanted to support me, but I suspect he also felt betrayed by Julia. She tried reaching out to him, but he was cautious, meeting her occasionally for lunch, never letting his guard down. I didn't interfere, figuring he'd find his own path in dealing with her. Meanwhile, I quietly continued severing ties. I filed for divorce, updated my address, spent evenings reading or working out in a small gym to blow off steam. I even signed up for a half marathon, something I'd always told myself I'd do, but never got around to. I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to prove I could still move forward. But it felt good. It felt like progress. One evening, I was sorting through socks, of all things, just folding them in my living room, with the TV droning in the background. I found that old pair labeled in marker, "Only my steps matter." The faint writing made me grin ruefully. Julia had once mocked me for being a neat freak about socks, calling me just a boy for writing on them. Now, the memory stung, but it also reminded me who I'd been before all this, and it reminded me of how she used to laugh at my quirks, back when that laughter was loving, not scornful. A tear threatened to form in my eye, but I blinked it away. I wasn't going to cry. I'd done enough silent grieving. Our final encounter came unexpectedly. Weeks after the divorce papers were signed, I went to the old house for the last time to pick up a few stray things. A toolbox, an old file cabinet from the garage. She was there, overseeing some repairs. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a sweater that seemed too big on her. The moment she saw me, her face crumpled, but she forced a brave smile. We exchanged awkward greetings. I sorted through the garage, lugged out the file cabinet. I was about to leave when she called my name. I turned. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice was composed as she said, "I lost everything I loved." I studied her face, the lines of regret, the sadness in her once bright eyes. "You lost yourself," I answered, my voice gentler than before. "I hope you find your way back." She started to speak, but words failed her. Instead, she just nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I noticed the wedding ring was gone from her finger. The symbolic finality of that moment pressed on my chest. I took a deep breath, set down the toolbox, and fished in my bag for a marker. With a quick motion, I wrote on the dusty mirror that leaned against the garage wall, an old piece of furniture we'd never gotten around to using. I scrawled, "You didn't lose to me. You lost to yourself." Then I snapped the cap back on. She swallowed hard when she read it. "Is that your last message?" "Yes," I said. "I'm done." I gripped the handle of the toolbox and walked away, forcing myself not to look back. The sky was overcast, but I felt no chill this time. Instead, I felt something akin to liberation. Every step I took away from that house, away from her, was a step toward the life I still had left to build. In the days that followed, I thought about vengeance, about hatred, about the many ways a person can lash out when betrayed. But in the end, I realized that my final act of revenge was a simple, devastating kind of indifference. I would not scream at her, destroy her possessions, or publicly shame her. I would just live my life without her. And that, I suspected, would be far more haunting than any revenge I could orchestrate. 1 month after finalizing the divorce, I found myself in my new place, alone at the kitchen table, finishing the last of a takeout meal. Jake was out with friends. A quiet peace settled over me. It struck me then that even though I was alone, I no longer felt lonely in the same way. I was healing, day by day, breath by breath. I rose, picked up my plate, and started cleaning up. My phone buzzed, a message from an old college buddy, inviting me to a weekend trip. I typed back a quick acceptance before I could talk myself out of it. No more letting life slip by. Outside the window, a cool drizzle began. Typical Seattle weather. I watched it for a moment, then let a small, wry smile tilt my lips. Sometimes, the only way to reclaim yourself is to walk into the rain, unafraid of getting soaked. My final thought as I flicked off the kitchen light was this: sometimes, indifference is the last gift you give to those who have betrayed you. Sometimes, the best revenge is to simply keep walking, never looking back. And so I did.